Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? My guest today is Laura Huang, an associate professor at Harvard Business School who has been named one of the 40 best business school professors under the age of 40 by Poets and Quants. Her research has been featured in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Forbes, and Nature. And she's here today to speak to us about her recently published book, Edge: How to Turn Adversity into Advantage. Laura, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you. So it's such a pleasure to be here.
It's great having you here. I was saying, normally I do the intros afterwards, after I've listened to the show and, and all that stuff, but I have a really compressed schedule. And part of it is due to the fact that I did the last leg of my coronavirus bug out shopping this weekend.
It's been crazy with the shopping. I went to Costco over the weekend and they had run out of meat. I mean, you go to Costco to stock up on this meat. They had no chicken. So I think lots of people have been doing the same thing.
So there's actually a friend of mine gave me advice on this. He's helped me stock provisions in general and prepare for the zombie apocalypse as a larger sort of thing. And one of the things that he says is that people panic, but they panic on a budget. So you should actually go to Whole Foods.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what I did.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I've already been, preparing in different ways, but I didn't have stuff from my apartment here.
I like that. That's how you're thinking differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where I find my edge.
I can see where you're going with this. But imagine how fun it is for me to be in the middle of a book tour, in the middle of this, possible pandemic. So that's real fun.
And you're Asian, as we discussed.
I know I'm Asian, and you gave me 2 big kisses as I got here. So, at least I see that I was managing your perceptions. I don't look
That's
like
so
I...
interesting. Well, it is great to have you. And to your point about that, we'll get into it. There was something you mentioned there that sparked something in my head, but we'll get to it from the rundown. So you're out with this new book. It was published when? Late January?
Yes.
Okay. And you've done a number of interviews. I heard one really fun one that you did with Jason Calacanis.
Yeah. He's a fun guy.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed
not
that.
Everyone describes him with the word fun, but
I know. I used to actually listen to him when I used to listen to Leo Laporte's podcast, This Week in Tech, back in 2008, 2009. He, Pete Cashmore, John C. Dvorak, those guys used to come. I don't know where Dvorak and Cashmore are these days, but so it's a great book. I read it. It's also manageable, which is great. I think one of the things I've come to realize is that for individual readers, having a shorter book, it is beneficial, but it's, where it really makes a difference is for the interviewers and for the people that are doing this every week. It makes a big difference because you have time to actually go through the book and
it's definitely a book that's, easily digestible in like one or 2 sittings. So, yeah.
So the book is called Edge: Turning Adversity into Advantage.
That's right.
So tell us what the book is about.
Yeah, I mean, so the book is about this. The main premise of it is that some people naturally have an advantage. And in a lot of situations, some situations that might be you, but other situations that's not you. And so when you're facing situations where you don't have that advantage, you can empower yourself to create your own advantage. And it goes back to sort of this principle of, we are from a very young age taught that hard work is sort of what it's about, that if you want to be successful, if you want to have the outcomes that you desire, to put in the hard work. And that's sort of the advice that we give people all the time, right? Work hard, and that'll speak for itself. And, at some point in our lives, we come to this realization that even though hard work is critical, there's no denying that it's critical, but hard work alone isn't enough. And instead, the outcomes are determined by by people's stereotypes and perceptions and attributions and lots of other things other than just hard work. And it's not just this pure meritocracy, that there is this sort of myth of meritocracy. So the book is really how we can flip circumstances and adversity and obstacles and stereotypes in our favor. How do we flip those in our favor so that we can create our own edge?
That's one of the things I really liked about the book, is that it kind of goes counter to the popular narrative today, which is focusing on our disadvantages and trying to basically get some kind of handicap or some kind of to be recognized for those disadvantages, as opposed to looking at ways to turn those disadvantages into advantages, to see what you can do as an individual, as opposed to what Jonathan Haidt has said in our podcast, which is to identify them and then appeal to some authority figure to rectify the situation, which is not how the real world works.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to be able to talk about how to rectify things. We definitely have a lot of things that need to be rectified, that need to be fixed. But we've been talking about what's broken for a really long time, decades. And we've talked about structural solutions, things that we need to do to make the world more, have more equality. And there's lots of people who are disadvantaged and underestimated. And how do we level the playing field? And the thing about that is that, in some cases, we may be able to fix things. But in other cases, we're either fixing things too slowly, or maybe we're changing things and we're fixing things, but we're not fixing them in the way that we intended them to. So this is really about how, even within an imperfect system, how we can empower ourselves to be making change for ourselves, to be addressing bias and discrimination and stereotypes, even within that imperfect system. And so that even when that system or that culture or those structures are changing from the outside in, we still have that ability to change things from the inside out. And I think both of those things need to happen. We need to be able to be changing the ways that we think about meritocracy, both from that outside in as well as the inside out.
So I want to get into all of that because I've laid out all the principles that you talk about in the book. Before we do, let's wind back a second here and tell our audience about who you are and how you came to be this person that you are today and writing this book.
Yeah. So for the last decade or so, more than a decade, I've been studying inequality and disadvantage and people who are underestimated. I started studying it in a variety of different contexts, but primarily in the workplace, and found all sorts of negative outcomes based on people's perceptions of one another.
Implicit biases.
Yeah, implicit bias, but even some of them very explicit bias. And I can give you some examples of that. But essentially, I found that based on people's perceptions, we're seeing negative outcomes like people who are less likely to get promoted, less likely to get raises, less likely to get hired for top management team positions. I also have seen this in entrepreneurship quite a bit. Differences in who gets funding for their startup ventures. And a lot of these started, it was a lot of these negative kind of effects that I was finding. And it was starting to get really depressing, right? People would ask me like, oh, you're finding that based on somebody's gender or race or ethnicity or class or religion or sexual orientation.
Or looks or weight or height or accents.
Absolutely.
How many variables did you look at?
Yeah, pretty much all of the normal cast of characters that you would expect, all of these sort of things that we would think that there would be disparities based on, and found that there was all of these sort of negative things. And so people would ask me, they would say, what can we do about this? What are there strategies and tactics and things that we can do to sort of level the playing field? And in fact, a lot of the research is about those structural things that we talked about. How do we get more mentors? How do we have algorithms that help us with hiring? But not a lot from like an individual perspective. Not a lot from the perspective of when you're there, when you're in that interview, are there ways that you can flip things in your favor? Are there ways that you can level the playing field? And so that's really what the last couple of years of my research has been about, and what culminated in this book, right, was really practical strategies and how-tos and tactics, things that individuals and leaders of organizations, people can do as individuals to sort of make this change, to inspire and instill this change.
I love that focus on the individual.
Thanks.
That's something that I think we've tried to do with this program, which is to identify the macro forces that are impacting all of us, but then provide listeners with the tools they need to navigate that world as individuals.
Yeah, and I think as individuals too, it's, it is certainly these interpersonal one-on-one relationships, but it's also, individuals on behalf of their organizations, right? There's definitely a lot of organizations out there that are sort of the little guy that are trying to battle against the behemoths. And this is something that, those small companies need to be doing too. They need to be trying to flip these perceptions and trying to be able to gain their own edge. And companies, as they grow in scale as well, one of the biggest issues that companies have as they start to achieve success is how do they stay nimble? How do they stay nimble and still maintain their bread and butter while they're growing and scaling? And this is something that applies there as well. But, at each of those, at the crux of each of that is an individual making decisions, an individual trying to interact with other people, even if it's on behalf of a company.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to where we were before you gave us your biography. And that has to do with some of these principles for EDGE. I guess we can go in two directions. One, you could tell us what EDGE stands for.
Yeah.
Maybe we can go in that direction first. So what are the acronyms for EDGE?
Yeah, so the book is about how to gain and create an edge but the EDGE actually stands for the EDGE, which is the framework that I've laid out, and the book is actually structured in those parts. The E stands for Enrich, and it's about how you enrich and provide value. So that's sort of the first piece of it, knowing what your basic goods are and the ways in which you enrich and provide value in any sort of context that you might be in.
Basic goods? What
Yeah, so basic goods, those are like, what are your superpowers? What are those 2 or 3 things that really define who you are and really make you what you are? I talk about it in the book a little bit in trying to sort of encapsulate what this is, my Taiwanese mother. So I was raised by immigrants, and my mother, who's from Taiwan, always, whenever she goes to cook something, she always starts out with, soy sauce and sesame oil and ginger and scallions kind of right in front of her. And no matter what dish she makes, even when she's sort of experimenting with different things or making, a variety of different things, that's the essence. Those are the flavors of any dish that she creates.
The base.
Yeah, that's really the base. Those are the basic goods. My husband, who's Italian, if he's cooking, right, he starts out with olive oil and garlic and red wine and so his basic goods, when he's cooking, those are different flavors. It's a different essence. And so when people are going out into any context, you might be sort of navigating in different ways or interacting with different sort of people, but what are those basic goods? What's that essence that you bring?
Could one also think of it as a competitive advantage in a Ricardian sense? It's what you do better than anything else that you can compete with, even if you're not as good as someone else at those things. That's what you're best at.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely has that element of what your strengths are, because a lot of times we think about our strengths and our weaknesses as just that, strengths and weaknesses. But, depending on the situation, it's really, what are those underestimated strengths? What are things that you are necessarily good at, but people might undervalue? But it could also be something as simple as what are those traits that really make you, right? If you take one person who is really trustworthy and really conscientious and really empathetic, you could take somebody else who's really conscientious and trustworthy, but if they don't have that empathy piece of it, it's a completely different person. So it's not an explicit, what are the 3 things you're good at, but it certainly could be that. And it's not explicitly what are the traits that embody you, but it certainly could be that.
So I know that you're a basketball fan.
Yes,
which again breaks stereotypes as an Asian woman.
Yes, it does.
Although Jeremy Lin has paved the way in some
direction. He has, but that guy, he's one of the hardest working athletes out there. And it sort of goes to show to some extent that, again, this message of it's not all about hard work. Hard work is critical, but hard work alone is not enough. And, I've been a lifelong Knicks fan, and man,
I'm sorry for you.
It's a team that's not always easy to root for.
I've been a Knicks fan as well, and I loved your reference of Anthony Mason in the book. I thought that was fantastic. Only a real Knicks fan from the 90s would be able to get that reference.
His shaved head, his hair.
And the writing. His barber would write it.
But
the reason I bring up basketball in this moment is because of Stockton and Malone, the pick and roll. That's their basic goods, right? That was it.
Yeah.
So why is it that hard work, as you say in the book, it should speak for itself, but it doesn't always speak for itself? Why is that the case? What do you mean when you say that?
I mean, look, when we take any super successful person, right? We see like CEOs of organizations and Olympic gold medal winners and people who've broken world records and all of these sorts of things. And you ask them and you say, like, what's the secret to your success? Inevitably, one of the things that they will bring up first or very quickly is hard work. And we teach our kids, work hard, put in that hard work, just put your head down and keep working. And I think it's absolutely a piece of it, but, sort of going back to the EDGE, right? The first E is Enrich. We can talk a little bit about the D and G in a second, but the last E is effort and hard work. And I put effort and hard work last in this. It's last because we often think it should come first, that if you put in that hard work, that things will sort of fall in line and you'll figure it out and you'll be able to show how you enrich and provide value and all those sorts of things. But a lot of times we just don't get that opportunity. We don't belong. We don't belong to the right networks. We don't belong to the right groups. We don't look the right way. We don't talk the right way. And so the E, that effort and hard work, it comes last, because when you're able to, when you know how you enrich and provide value, when you know how you delight, which is the D, and you know how you can guide, that's when your effort and hard work actually works harder for you.
All right, we'll get into them because especially delight, I think, is not counterintuitive. It's difficult to grasp.
Yeah.
So it'll be helpful to give some examples.
Yeah.
Also, for listeners who haven't heard our episode with David Epstein, there's a good reference there as well about hard work not necessarily being the way to success. You could be working really hard, but you suck at whatever you're doing. If your mom forced you to play tennis and you don't like it, don't keep hitting those balls. You're not going to get any better.
Yeah.
So that's important. Okay, so how do we change that? One of the things I was thinking about is I have a friend, she was recently telling me about this, about how hard she works. She's not running her own business, or she is on the side, but she has, her primary income comes from another startup that she manages operations for. And she was talking about the frustration that she has with the amount of work that she puts in, but because she's not so great at politics, that others take credit for that hard work. Mm-hmm. How does someone manage that? In that context?
I mean, I think there's two pieces there. I mean, the first is that, yes, there are politics in there, but this is not something that's strategic and manipulative in that sense, right? This is actually the opposite of that, because what you're really trying to do is you are redirecting and guiding people to who you authentically are. This is a very authentic thing. The more you authentically know how you enrich and provide value, the more you're going to be able to deal with and interact with those who may write you off, or where the odds may be stacked against you, or even those who may be more politically skilled than sort of you are. So, I talk about how in order to make any progress, or in order to really have that, to be able to create an edge, it takes two things. I mean, it takes really truly being able to enrich in a situation and provide value, and it takes your counterpart in believing that and seeing that. And the question is there an and in between those two things, or is there an or? And some people have the second. They're really good at convincing others that they enrich and provide value.
Elizabeth Holmes example in the book.
Yeah, perfect example, right? I mean, this was someone who everyone wanted to believe had
black
something.
turtleneck.
Yeah. I mean,
kind of looking a little geeky, weird, low voice.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's some who even say that she, honed that. She really tried to get that voice deep. And
there's actually like audio of her speaking normally.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there's been lots that has been sort of said about Theranos and about Elizabeth Holmes, but right, there's a classic example of, for a while people believe that, but you really don't have something.
You don't got the goods.
Yeah. And so you can sustain, some people can sustain that for a long time. And that's what's sort of frustrating is we see those people and we know those people. We all have instances that we can point to of someone who kisses up to the boss and it just really rubs us the wrong way, or somebody who seems to get by totally on hype, but there's nothing really behind that. And that's what sort of bothers us, because then we're like, we don't want to be that person. We don't want to be seen as that. But this is really something very different. It's about how to create and really gain a true sustained edge for yourself.
So this kind of raises two questions for me. One is, how can we delineate between substance and hype, particularly in a world like today? You're familiar with this. You work with a lot of entrepreneurs. Liquidity has been widely available for a long time, and a lot of people have been able to get away with very little substance and just a lot of really great hype.
Yeah.
So one question is, how do you really differentiate between that?
Yeah.
And the other one is, kind of more to the point you were making, how do you remain authentic while at the same time sort of somewhat hyping yourself up,
Yeah.
Take those as you will.
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first, then I'll go back to the first one. So I talk a lot about how people are like, I mean, if you think of everybody like a diamond, like everyone is a solitary diamond, and every diamond has flaws. And every diamond is going to be cut differently and have different angles and different facets. And depending on, things like the lighting or the environmental conditions or the person that's looking at it, that diamond is going to shine in different ways, right? It's going to shine differently. It's going to shine more brightly in some situations based on the lighting and the environment and
the context.
All of those sorts of things. But it's still the same diamond. It's still the same diamond with the same flaws and the same coloring and the same cut and all of those sorts of things. And that's really what you're doing when you're interacting with other people. You're just showing them the side of your diamond that's going to shine the brightest. There's nothing inauthentic about that. There's no reason why you have to go into a situation and let them observe you and let them write a story about who you are. This is about walking into a room where there's going to be impressions made of you. It's about going into a room where that they're trying to write the narrative or tell themselves a story about who you are. And instead of letting them do that in perhaps the incorrect or a wrong or a misguided way, you go in there and you sort of write that story for them of who you authentically are. You go in there and you show them the angle of your diamond that's going to shine the brightest. That's where you're going to have the richest, deepest connection with someone. And when you do that, that's a much more authentic sort of connection where two people are showing that side of themselves that allows them to really engage with each other in a deeper way. And, a lot of times we don't necessarily do that, but we also forget that we're different people based on who we are already, based on, if we're with our best friend versus with our mother versus with a teacher versus with the boss.
We have different aspects of ourselves.
We do.
We aren't one
That's
self.
right. That's right. We are varied and complicated people who have so many different dimensions. And so when we sort of say like, be yourself, and if you're not yourself, it's inauthentic. That's just wrong because there are so many different versions of ourselves and we can be very authentic in very different ways. And it's just impossible that you're going to be able to show somebody all of those different dimensions of yourselves all at once.
That's a really good point. I mean, you're obviously not going to act the same way with your mother as you would with your girlfriend.
That's right.
Or you shouldn't. You have a lot of problems.
I don't know. But the Italians and the Greeks, I don't know.
Some people have issues with that. But that makes a lot of sense. I think that's actually a really great point. So your point, if I understand it, is you want to take control of others' perception of you and not allow their biases, stereotypes, or even where they're at emotionally in that moment.
That's right.
To define you.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, people are making impressions and are, perceiving us and making attributions all the time. And what we forget also is that it differs. It's not always the same perceptions. As soon as you change one variable, the industry that you're in, the company that you're in, the mix of individuals that you're with, those impressions are going to differ, right? When I walk in as an Asian woman into a classroom, I'm going to be perceived differently than when I'm an Asian woman courtside at a Knicks game versus an Asian woman, and so on and so forth,
so
right? So, you have to be able to, part of gaining and creating your edge is being able to know and have these skill set where you can read a room and you can read the way that others are perceiving you. And so I talk a lot in the book about different ways that you can think about that and different ways that you can hone that, your ability to sort of have others, walk in and know how others are perceiving you.
It's so interesting. That makes me think of something that I haven't thought about in a long time. When I was getting back into tech after a long hiatus, I had started a theater company. And I had created these really beautiful cards. They were square cards. I put a lot of money into making them. And the company was called Offline.
Okay.
It was an off-Broadway theater company. And I would start going to a lot of these tech meetups or hackathons or whatever. And I would introduce myself as a theater producer. And I would give that card. And it made such an impression because it separated me from everyone else in the crowd because everyone was expecting some typical pitch. I was like, no, actually I have a theater company. I just love this stuff and I'm here to, wow. And everyone would actually take notice. That's a really interesting, would that qualify?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I milked that big time, consciously.
I'm glad.
So I guess then the natural question is, how do you find what your basic goods are? How do you figure out what your edge is?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of different ways that I sort of talk about. I mean, I guess one way to sort of put it is I talk about how life rhymes. These are sort of situations in which you notice that time after time and time again, even though they might be different contexts, there's things that start to have similarities. Like you'll be in one situation as a child, for instance, and something will happen, and for whatever reason, you'll get this feeling, either a good feeling or a bad feeling, and you can't quite place what it is. And then later in life, you'll be in a different situation entirely, but you'll start to have that same feeling like that. You start to see these patterns, and that's one of
relying on your intuition or your subconscious intelligence.
Yeah, and a lot of my research is around intuition and knowing in which instances. I mean, we tend to think that intuition and gut feel is always this subconscious, emotional, quick thing, but in fact your intuition is based on your experiences and patterns that you're seeing, and knowing the difference between when you should go into a situation and be very, very analytical versus other situations where you should sort of ignore the data and be completely intuitive. That's something that really is an important piece of everyone in this and their own kind of basic goods, knowing that sort of difference. But, it's just sort of understanding that life rhymes and seeing those sort of patterns. But, essentially also something I talk a lot about in the book is that, everyone can kind of learn and figure out what their basic goods are, but not everyone is willing to. And what I mean by that is that willingness, it comes with this willingness to understand that there will be failure, there will be drawdowns, and that failure, there's so much information, there's so much data in that failure, because there's information about why you failed, but also information about why you consider it a failure and why it's considered such a big failure to you, whereas somebody else might not consider that to be a failure at all. So there's information that around what you care about and what your values are. And similarly, but distinct in its own way, the failure piece is something we hear a lot about, like knowing that you're going to fail and that you need to get through those and how do you sort of deal with failure. But embarrassment is something that is so critical that we don't think enough about. Sometimes it's not failure that prevents people from doing something again. It's often embarrassment. There's, for whatever reason, you're embarrassed, and then that's when people say like, oh no, never again will I put myself in that situation.
Embarrassed because of what other people may think?
It could be a variety of different things. It could be some sort of a pride thing and you feel embarrassed, or it could be, something as simple as you give a speech and you say something wrong and now you feel embarrassed because you didn't intend for it to go that way. But there's so much data.
There's a lot of that happening these days.
Yeah, there is. And this is a whole separate topic. But, and I think what we're not doing enough of is trying to listen for people's intent rather than their words. I mean, how many of us, we have all been in situations, I would venture to guess, where we've said something and, later on we're like, I didn't mean it that way. I hope they didn't think that I meant it that way. And we don't have that opportunity to then go back and be like, just to make sure I didn't mean it that way. I meant it in this way. But yet when others do that to us, we don't think about that intent. We just sort of assume what we want to assume, and we make attributions based on those sort of comments.
Intention versus impact.
That's right. So we really don't think about that difference often. We evaluate others based on impact. We evaluate ourselves based on intent.
It's interesting. I'm reminded, I think, Jonathan Haidt. There are a number of guests that keep coming up in my head as you talk. The one that keeps coming up is David Epstein, and he came up right before when you were talking about what he refers to as sampling period.
May this book be as successful as Range.
Yeah, I know. Well, he's great. I mean, the Sports Gene, that's also a great book. But he talks about a sampling period, which failure is important because it gives you feedback, it gives you information. But also, Jonathan, I think, mentioned this, that the younger generations and maybe popular culture at large is telling people that what matters is their experience, how they felt, how it impacted them.
Yeah.
Intention isn't what's important.
Yeah.
But in fact, you've made that point that intention is very important and it should be front and center. And then, in fact, you work on your students with that.
That's right. And the thing about that is that there is this dichotomous relationship between intent and impact. And we don't really put those things together often, where we think about intent, impact hand in hand. And so, that's one of those things that, Jonathan talks about it, David talks about it. And I think it's responsible for a lot of sort of the things we see nowadays and that's responsible for a lot of, people are now sort of at this stage sometimes where they're like, oh, I'm like afraid. I don't even want to say anything. I don't even want to because I don't want to get burned. I don't want to get burned again because I've done that before and it backfired on me. But those are in fact the situations where we can learn so much that we should be doubling down and doing more of that, embarrassing ourselves more, embracing failure more, because like I said, there's so much information in that.
Yeah, there's so much there to explore around what are basically purity spirals where you can get caught in one of those and it can be devastating. It can destroy your life. But let's go back to this thing about intuition. I'm curious, in your research, what have you found, let's say, in the VC community? How important is intuition in terms of informing investors about whether to invest in or not invest in any particular product or pitch?
This is where,
or entrepreneur.
Yeah, and this is where so much of like this edge piece comes in. So I spoke a little bit before about how, one of the things that's really important to do is to understand which situations we should be much more analytically driven and data driven, in which situations we should be guided by our intuition and allow ourselves that space to go with our gut. And, I studied venture capitalists and angel investors and how they make their decisions. And one of the things that I found is that angel investors who make decisions based on their gut feel and their intuition are actually much more likely to be able to pinpoint the absolute home runs. These are the extraordinarily profitable ventures out there. When they are asked to sort of justify and explain and back up their intuition with data, that's when they get in trouble. They almost talk themselves out of investing in those ventures that'll ultimately become home runs. Now, this doesn't mean that they're more successful on an aggregate basis long term in terms of just pure ROI, but it does mean that they're more likely to be able to pinpoint those outliers.
Is that because the analysis is so complex, it's so multivariate that it can't happen on a conscious level?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of complexity. But so there's a couple of different dimensions to this. One is that there is so much uncertainty and so much complexity that we can't possibly be able to analytically analyze everything, to analytically look at everything that's out there. But the second piece of it is really this aspect of we tend to think that things that are, for example, financials or hard numbers or things that are in written format are more reliable, that that's the hard data and that everything else is the soft data.
The woo-woo.
Yeah, exactly. But instead, like those numbers, those financials, I mean, those are just hopes and dreams and guesses, right? That's actually the soft stuff.
Yeah, that's also artistic. A lot of those decks are pure
I mean,
art.
I don't even know if it's artistic anymore. They all look like hockey sticks and we all sort of know.
But I mean,
that,
knowing what numbers to put out there and just the right increments.
That's right. And so that's just the hopes and dreams and guesses. That's like what we would project. This is where we think the break even is. Here's what we think our metrics are. But so much of that is not hard data. What's really hard about is predicting how trustworthy someone is or how committed they are or how well they're going to be able to execute on what it is that they're talking about. And that's what's embedded in someone's gut feel, is your ability to read and understand and predict how competent and committed and trustworthy someone is. And so being able to know that difference is something that's really important and gives some investors that advantage. But, and then the third piece of this is that angel investing in venture capital, that world, the early stage entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurial finance world, I mean, this is a situation where rationally, no one should be making investments. If you actually look at the ROIs and the risk and the returns, like this is a situation where nobody should be making investments based on typical financial capital markets sort of projections. And so the gut feel, that's like what allows them to pull the trigger. It's I know that I can predict this above and beyond what is rational and what should be. So there's that element of that as well. And so we need to also be able to take those chances on ourselves in situations too.
So in this section of the book where you're talking about this, you also write that the longest lines are not always for the best rides.
Yeah.
And I really loved that. And I loved what that was about, which was your larger point, which is that some of the greatest ideas or the most lucrative markets are where no one is there. No one's servicing that market.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with that. But I think one of the difficulties for an investor or an entrepreneur is always Well, is that because there's some pandemic over there?
Yeah.
Taking it in the contemporary sense, and
Right.
that's why no one's addressing it? Or is there really something there, and a lot of people aren't addressing it because they think that since no one's there, no one should address it, et cetera, and it's all for you. It's a wide open field, and you can go and you can build and you can address.
Yeah. I mean, the wide open field, it's exactly what you're sort of saying. I mean, sometimes that wide open field is there because nobody should go there. I mean, there's no point in sort of going there. There's nothing interesting there. Maybe no one's studying it because it's not interesting, or maybe no one's buying or creating products and services because it's not a good space to sort of be in, and there's no one will go there. But when I talk about sort of these open spaces or these gaps to fill, it's really about paradox. It's about where are there areas in which there's still some sort of a puzzle. Another way to put it is, where are there inefficiencies? When you're seeing that there's inefficiencies where some lines are really, really long and some lines are really, really short, but essentially it's the same product, or some places that are really crowded and some that are not, but they're really in the same area, right? You're looking for those inefficiencies, and that's where you're able to sort of really capitalize and find interesting new things. But we don't do that. And I talk in the book about a variety of different examples of people who have sought out those inefficiencies and done some really big things. Yeah.
So speaking of having difficulty delineating, there's another quote in the book, not of yours, but of Abraham Lincoln's, where Abraham Lincoln says, if I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 6 hours sharpening the axe.
Yeah.
First of all, the first thing I thought about when I read that was like, of course, only someone that lived in 1860 would know that you need about 2 hours to chop a tree.
Yeah.
So you can spend the other six
right.
sharpening the axe. But this raises an interesting dilemma, and it's one that I have often struggled with when trying to either work with other entrepreneurs or coach someone through something, which is a lot of times people spend so much time preparing that they never actually act. There's this great quote, I think it's by the founder of IDEO, which is, don't get ready, get started. But of course, you don't want to just jump into something without any forethought.
Right.
So how do you balance that?
Yeah, I talk about it as, I mean, you need to prepare, but don't over prepare. You want to sort of go for directionality. So I talk a lot about how, you know, we think in our lives like, okay, I need to go from point A to point B. And the problem is that, number one, there's so many different ways that you can get to point B. Also, just going from point A to point B creates a lot of constraints for yourselves. You're not going to be able to, you know, dynamically pivot and dynamically impress people and figure out the different ways in which you enrich when you do it in such a linear fashion. But if you go for directionality, just go in the direction of B, but allow yourself to sort of get pulled and zig and zag. And that's when you're able to really continue to figure out what you're good at and what your strengths are and how you're going to have those deeper relationships with people. And
would you say it's important to set a target, even if it's in the general vicinity? It's not going to be exactly right, but say, you know, I want to double my revenues this year. I want to address this much market share.
Yeah, you want to have those sort of targets, but you might find, for example, that in your industry that the revenues are really irrelevant, because once you start thinking about market share and doubling and tripling and quadrupling your market share, the revenue takes care of itself. Whereas when it's sort of like, I need X revenue, you might not be thinking about market share because you're so concerned with that revenue number. And the same vice versa. If you start thinking
you're
just
creating
about
an artificial ceiling.
You're creating that. And when you go for directionality and you start thinking about things in terms of that general direction, you allow yourself to have that opportunity to think, oh, hey, you know, here's an opportunity for us to really double our revenue, or here's an opportunity for us to increase our market share. And like, there's so many instances outside of just those financial indicators, but we become tethered to that. And that's what happens when we're over prepared. We start to say, I mean, even in interactions with others, like, you know, especially when the odds are against us or when we feel like that person disagrees with us and we're trying to change their minds. I mean, we go in and we're like, here are the 6 bullet points that I have, and I'm going to say this to that person. I'm going to so wow them with these points that I have that they're automatically going to be like, yep, you know what? You're right. That's what we think in our heads, that we're like, we prepare and we have all of these arguments crafted and thought over, and we mull over it again and again and again over our heads. And then we have that conversation with that person, and we're so tethered to those arguments. We're so tethered to that linear way that we're going to change their mind. And we go in there and we're like, here are my 6 best points, and let me tell you. And we forget that a lot of times, especially when we care so much about something, and especially when we're trying to change somebody's mind. Yeah. And instead, the actual best way to approach that is less like advocating and pushing your points, but going in much more with like a inquiry, general directionality standpoint of like, even saying like, help me understand how you got to this strategy and I got to this strategy. And like, it's the opposite of like, your strategy is not right and here's the reasons why mine is right. You go and you're just like, help me understand how you got to this strategy. And that allows you to sort of bob and weave and delight and do all of these sorts of things that you can do to actually then show the value you're providing. So.
I think, no, that's a great point. And also, I think there's something to be said. So there are a lot of thoughts I have about the ceiling, and it brings us into a conversation about embracing constraints, which is your fourth principle. But it's the same thing as if you want to get someone's number.
Yeah.
If your goal is to get their number,
yeah,
then you've given yourself a lot of flexibility to improvise, right? And to get there. But if your goal is to basically make this person like you, well, you might get yourself in.
Yeah. But even like getting somebody's number, like that's also like, why not just, hey, I want to have the conversation where this person is so interested by me that they want to meet with me again, or that they ask me to coffee, or that they do this, or that they like invite me to pitch their company, or they say, who else would like to meet you? Because maybe it's not about getting that person's number. Maybe it's about, that person's like, who else you should meet who would love you is X, Y, and Z. And so like, that's really what you're able to do when you have those deeper connections.
I was thinking about it much more in a personal context. Like,
you mean like someone's phone
like
number? I was like, okay.
Well, I just meant like, because I think that there's a lot of similarity. I think that the same principles that make someone like you or want to go on a date with you or give you their number, a lot of that also works in when you're trying to impress someone who's an investor or who you might want to bring onto your team. Because so much of that, what's there is that it's about personal. It's about liking.
Yeah.
Like the person got to like you.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this is something that I talk about how it really applies. And it's not just in the workplace, right? This is really for gaining an edge in the workplace, but also in life. And
being yourself, to your whole point. Like, you got to be yourself.
That's
you can't
right.
get someone to like someone that you're not, because you suck at that.
That's right. And it always reminds me too, like for whatever reason, like parents love to ask professors for parenting advice. I have no idea why, but they love to ask professors like, about things that their kids are happening with their kids or whatever. And what I found sort of the interesting thing that I've seen over the years, especially with parents is that they're trying so hard to give their kids an advantage. They're like trying to buy their kids. Who
are those people that were the
like
Full
Felicity
House mom?
Huffman and Lori Loughlin. Yeah, exactly. Like
that's insane.
It's insane, right? They're trying to buy their kids certain SAT scores, buy their way into colleges and universities. And
they should have. If I'm going to buy my kids somewhere, I'd buy them into Harvard or something. I wouldn't buy them into
and Harvard was not mentioned in that. I mean, like, knock on wood that so far, like, there's no indictment on Harvard as an institution for that one at least. But even on a more legal way, parents everywhere are trying to do this, right? Yeah. They're trying to give their kids extra tutoring and private coaches and extra experiences that other kids don't have.
Force them to play the violin.
Yeah, all of
play
these
lacrosse,
all of these
fencing.
Things. That's right. So it's like parents are fighting so hard to give their kids an advantage. And the thing is, it will help in one dimension. Like, you will give your kids an advantage in that dimension. But why not teach them how to create their own edge in any context, right? When they're able to understand how others perceive them in different contexts, in whatever sort of context they might be in, and the different ways that they enrich and provide value in those different contexts, and allow them to sort of dynamically know how to manage the impressions that others have of them. That's where you're sort of teaching them to be able to create their own advantage for themselves in any situation that they're in, rather than parents always having to force it and give them that. So that's another thing that I've seen, like, in addition to sort of like the life, like the workplace, the asking people on dates, giving a big presentation at work, all of these sort of things. It's so critical to the ways that we interact with each other now.
So let's go back to this point about scarcity and constraints. We identified one of the negative aspects of this, which is that you create artificial ceilings. You cap yourself artificially.
Yeah. But
there's also a great benefit to operating in an environment of scarcity.
Yeah.
And this is something that I've found to be true in my own experience, which is that when I have an abundance of resources, I make of many mistakes.
Yeah.
And it ends up costing me much later.
Yeah.
So how do you think about this? How do you write about this in the book, and why is this important?
Yeah, I mean, constraints are something that we typically think are negatives, but in fact, they sometimes, having those constraints allow us to think about problems in different ways, think about solutions in different ways. I talk about one of these exercises that I do with my students that professors at Stanford and Harvard and a couple of us are doing, but it's called the $5 exercise. And I did this in my entrepreneurship class where I would give teams an envelope with $5 inside. And the goal of this was in a 2-week period, they had to start some sort of a small company or a small business using the money that they had in the envelope as their startup capital. And at the end of the 2 weeks, they had to give a presentation on what they did and how much money they made. And, a lot of the teams would do things like the normal things that we would expect, right? They use that $5 to buy supplies for a car wash, soap and sponges. And they started washing cars and they made, some of them made a couple $100s and that sort of thing. Bake sales where they would buy ingredients and then they would sell those baked goods, again, making, $100, a little over that or whatever the case may be. And the point of the exercise, the goal of the exercise is what we demonstrate is that the teams that actually do the best are the ones that never spent the $5 at all. Some of them never even, or maybe they opened the envelope, but they didn't even do anything with it. So they weren't constrained by the $5 because a lot of times we see that $5 like, okay, this is what I have. So now I'm going to think about the types of companies I can start with this $5. The teams that did the best are the ones that didn't think about it as a constraint. They thought about constraint in a different way. So for example, one team made little videos of some talent that they had or some special unique talent that they had. And then they sent it to all of their friends, charged an admission, and did this event where they all would teach others their talents. Another did this thing called the moving dinner, where you would start out having appetizers at one person's place, and then the main meal at another person's house, and then the dessert at another person's apartment or place. And then at the end of that, they all met up at a bar. And the problem they were trying to solve is that people don't like to network. And it's awkward sometimes to stand there with like a drink in your hand and try and network somebody. But if you're like having a meal or you're preparing the meal or whatever, and they charged sort of everybody to go to this moving dinner, the teams that did the best are the ones that were able to not think about those sort of constraints in the normal way that we think about. And you asked me earlier about like, how do we develop our basic goods? How do we think about, one of the ways that we think about our basic goods and discover those is also not only through like the failures and the embarrassments, but also through thinking about constraints and our own constraints in a different way. So an exercise that I sometimes do in some of the workshops that I hold when I can't have people do the full $5 exercise is I have them do this thing called the 10 no's. And what the 10 no's is, the point of this is that over some small period of time, I don't know, an hour, a week, whatever, the assignment for students or the workshop participants is that you need to get 10 people to say no to you. And it can't be a hedge. It can't be like, nah, well, but I'll do this instead. It has to be like a full-fledged no. So if somebody hedges, you got to start all over with someone new with a different ask. And when the assignment
that would be so difficult to do.
Yeah, and you got to get 10 people to say no, and then you got to report back on what happened. And what this does, it's really interesting because we're so programmed. Our minds, our lives are so programmed to want people to like us, to want people to say yes to us, to want to be agreeable and get others to agree with us. And with this assignment, with this exercise, the whole point of it, you have permission to have people say, in fact, you don't succeed, you don't do it right unless somebody says no to you. And when you do that, you realize the different ways that you communicate with different people. It's building a different muscle. It's putting you in different situations where you're realizing how you communicate and how you frame things to different sets of people in different ways, because it's
so
flipping it on its head. You also realize that people are a lot less willing to say no than you think. And you also realize that the ways in which you think about constraints and your basic goods and the things that you're good at really also get flipped on your head, because it's something that we're never really we're building different types of mental models and prototypes and schemas that are always predicated on this like yes, agreeableness, likability culture. And when we do that, we sort of give ourselves permission and the opportunity to hone these things. And that's one of the ways we also hone our intuition and gut feel. So I talk about lots of these different strategies and things or tactics or how-tos, different ways that we can hone our ability to kind of create our own edge.
So it abstracts the process in a sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, in some ways, what we're really doing in order to gain an edge is like A/B testing our interactions with others. Yeah.
And in this point, I just want listeners to meditate on this point about constraints and the $5. Because, I mean, I read it in the book. Also, I read the funny, somewhat also kind of annoying thing that one of the pair of students did, or the group of students, is the ones that they said they were just going to spend it on lifestyle.
Yes.
They made it, I thought that was kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, well, you always have those students. These are the students that were like, you know what, we care about lifestyle, not profits. And so they basically bought a roasted chicken with the $5 and the one roasted chicken to share amongst all of them and their partners, and they did a dinner.
Yeah, I would have been like, I'm not impressed. But I think it's really powerful because you can see it right there how inherently limiting it is, because you're basically saying, okay, how do I figure out a way to spend this $5 in the most profitable way possible?
Yeah.
Instead of saying I need to create the most profitable or best.
That's right.
And so it's so incredibly limiting.
That's right. And I also talk about, different ways that we're constrained, not just by, like, for example, we often think about problems that we need solutions to. And we often don't think about solutions that are out there that it can address problems. I mean, we talk, for example, like 3D printing is something that we all sort of know about. 3D printing was invented back in like 1981 or something. And for a while, it just sort of sat there as this thing. I mean, you have this box that can pretty much make anything. And we really didn't even know what to do. It was like a solution that we didn't know what to do with. And so thinking about problems in search of solutions, as well as solutions in search of problems, we also have this tendency to think linearly. Everything in our lives, we're like, okay, if I do this, it leads to that, and that leads to that. And we think about everything in terms of like linearity. But very few things in life are linear. A lot of things in life are exponential or U-shaped or inverted U-shaped. There's lots of different patterns and ways that things kind of progress. And we don't try and understand that often enough.
And that goes back to, it touches on intuition. And I think to the larger point, it's a way of embracing having faith. Having faith in the process, just sort of going out there and being willing to go and not be over prepared.
Yeah.
Again,
and
right?
not just having faith in the process, but also having faith in you and your way of doing it, right? So imagine, there's so many people out there who they're aspirational to something. They see somebody who, for example, has a job that they would love to somehow have someday, right? Or they see some leader of their organization and they're like, I would love to be that person someday. And so they ask that VP or that CEO or whatever of that organization, and they say, like, how did you get to be where you are now? And that CEO will say, like, oh, well, then I got this degree, and then I went to get my MBA, and then I did this like stint in sales and whatever. But I can guarantee you, right, if you do the exact same things that person did, you definitively will not get to be that person, because you are a different person. You are a completely different person. And so if you follow that same path that somebody else followed, you will definitively not get to the same place.
But that's so true. And that go back to your mom and the base that she uses to cook, or your Italian husband.
Yes.
You can give someone the exact same cooking formula, but they could create something that tastes really wonderful, or just blah.
Yes.
And they follow the same formula because there's so much else that goes into it.
Yeah.
Some people talk about it in terms of, the love that you put into your cooking or whatever it is, that thing.
Yeah, and it's not formulaic. And a lot of times people say, like, what are the 6 steps? There are 5 steps that I need to create my own edge. And I'm like, I wish I could give you the recipe. I wish I could say, like, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. But the thing is, the more personal you make this, the more you really engage with who you are and your basic goods and the ways in which, and the perceptions that people are going to have about you that are going to be very different than the perceptions that they have about someone else. the more you embrace all of that and go into that and understand that, the more you're going to be able to create your own edge.
Yeah. This also reminds me a little bit, it's a bit of a stretch, but a little bit of our conversation with Jerry Colonna, and when he would coach people through the difficult leadership challenges they had, and some people that were very angry would come into the sessions and say, where's the leadership handbook? You must be keeping it from me. And there's so much in terms of trusting yourself and that. Laura, I want to move us into the overtime, but before I do, I want to grease the runway a little bit here and just touch on delight.
Yeah.
And at least give listeners a sense of what delight is before we get into the rest of the stuff of the episode. So what is delight?
Yeah, so we've only gotten as far as the D for
exactly.
The EDGE, the D is for delight. And delight is really, it's this sort of, it's hard to kind of bottle and understand what the delight is about, but it's some factor, it's some quality that makes somebody take pause. When you're able to delight someone, that's the equivalent of cracking the door open. So they sort of pause and say, like, I never saw you or saw this person in that way. And when they do that, that's when that sort of conversation starts. They'll either ask a question or they'll want to learn more. And that's when you're able to sort of enrich and show how you provide value.
So I think also one of the things I really liked in the book when you talked about this was that it violates perceptions, but in a benign way.
That's right.
And you see here, this is not a movie that you've seen, Laura. It's because I asked you about it. The movie's called Life with Mikey. I think it came out in 1993, maybe.
Is it Michael J. Fox?
Michael J. Fox. Yeah. And I don't remember this girl's name, but she was this Dominican girl or Dominican-looking girl from the Bronx.
Okay.
And she picked his pocket, stole his wallet, etc. But there was a scene where she was in a casting session and she met with a lead producer of some television network or something like that. And she just absolutely delighted him because here was this dirty-mouthed, girl from the Bronx, and she defied all of his expectations. You know what I mean? So I think that's...
It reminds me of another movie, Curly Sue. Have you seen that?
You know what? I remember all the commercials for it or all the trailers, but I don't think I actually ever saw it.
It's like, it reminds me, so maybe yours is the Life with Mikey and mine is the Curly Sue. I was so delighted and enamored by Curly Sue because she was this girl who was homeless, but she's just such this like precocious, someone who sort of you engage with her and so it's like that same sort of feeling that it's bringing out. So I totally know where you're going with this and love it. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to move us into the overtime. Some of the things I want to discuss are more practical ways to implement this if you're an entrepreneur or if you're an investor.
Sure.
For regular listeners, you know the drill. If you're new to the program or if you haven't subscribed yet to our audiophile, autodidact, or super nerd tiers, head over to patreon.com/hidden forces or scroll down to the summary section of this week's episode and click on the link that sends you to our Patreon page, as well as the link that shows you how to integrate the Patreon RSS link into your podcast application of choice. Laura, stick around. We'll be right back.
Okay, thanks.
Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.